Thanks again for joining us today. I'll hand it off to our moderator, Chris Lynn, the manager of DVRPC's Office of Climate and Environment.
Thanks, Zoe, for that great introduction. And again, welcome everyone. And thanks for joining us for this day one of this two-part discussion on managing Philadelphia's flood risk in a changing climate. So again, I'm Chris Lynn with the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And I guess I'd just like to start today by saying that DVRPC, as we go by, has been working with the city and other partners to raise awareness about the impacts of climate change on flooding and how to manage it, through a variety of planning projects for some time now. But I really think that the real work of managing, mitigating, and recovering from flooding events happens at the local, municipal, and city level with assistance from county, state, and federal partners. So we'll be hearing from those entities directly, as well as community members who are impacted by flooding over the next 2 days. So, we all know that flooding is a big problem in Philadelphia, from stormwater flooding that drowns streets and fills basements, to damaging riverine floods like we saw on the Schuylkill River with Hurricane Ida last September, to coastal flooding on the tidal Delaware River. We also know that climate change will likely increase the frequency and severity of these types of flooding events. And that, coupled with the fact that flooding is both episodic and unpredictable, makes it a challenge that's inherently difficult for societies to address. So against this backdrop, our two-part discussion is going to focus on understanding flood risks in Philadelphia, how climate change is exacerbating these risks, and what city officials and departments and individuals can do to minimize these risks and also recover equitably from flooding events. So, more specifically, today's discussion is going to focus on how, where, and why Philadelphia is vulnerable to flooding, how climate change is going to exacerbate flooding, the city's efforts to reduce risks from flooding, the experience of community members and neighborhoods living in flood-prone areas, and finally, some of the short and long-term impacts of flooding on city finances and budgets. And again, tomorrow's discussion, just so you're all aware, is going to focus more specifically on hazard mitigation, on the role of flood insurance, and flood recovery efforts. So we have, as Zoe mentioned, we have 4 excellent panelists who are graciously joining us today, all of whom, have extensive experience with flooding issues. They represent community groups, city agencies, and academic institutions. Our panelists include Abby Sullivan, an environmental scientist with the Philadelphia Water Department, who works with the department's climate change adaptation program. We have Carolyn Mosley, executive director of Eastwick United, a community development corporation working in part to address the physical, economic, and social dimensions of flooding in Eastwick. Saleem Chapman, the city's first chief resilience officer, who's housed in the city's Office of Sustainability. And finally, today we have Clint Andrews, a professor of urban planning at the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University, who works at the intersection of climate change and planning. So in just a moment, we're going to hear a brief 5-minute set of remarks or presentation from each of our panelists. And then after that, I'm going to pose a series of questions with the panelists to get the conversation started. And then finally, we're going to open it up to questions from members of the audience. So again, as Zoe said, please use the Q&A feature in your Zoom windows, at any time during the program when questions may arise. So with that, all that said, I'm now happy to turn it over to Abby Sullivan from the Water Department, which has led a lot of the city's efforts to understand the impacts of climate change on flooding, and has been using this information to better position the city to withstand and recover flooding events. So Abby, take it away. I think you have a few slides, so please share your screen as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Zoe. So yeah, I will share my screen, get this going. Okay, can everybody see my slides? Oops. Yeah, okay, great. So we only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to quickly get through this. So we are a water utility in Philadelphia, and we are what we call a one water utility, meaning that we're actually almost like 3 in 1. So we provide 3 separate services: drinking water services, wastewater, and stormwater. And why I bring that up is just that we have tons and tons of assets and infrastructure, thousands of miles of drinking water pipes, thousands of miles of sewer pipes, pumping stations, and we have major treatment facilities, both for drinking water and also for wastewater. And you can see those on this map here. The red dots are the drinking water, the teal squares are our wastewater facilities. And these happen to be very close to our rivers and creeks. And that's because our drinking water source is our rivers. So the Schuylkill and the Delaware River are our source waters. And so we have to have critical infrastructure right along those rivers and creeks. And same with our wastewater plants. After we treat wastewater, we then release that back into the Delaware River. And so you can see that these facilities are very close to the river's edge, and that's why they are particularly vulnerable to flooding. I work on the climate change adaptation program, as Chris mentioned, and this program was started in 2016, and it really is to address the risks that we already face, but that are being exacerbated or amplified by climate change. And we have a saying that climate change is water change. I mean, basically every piece of climate change. So as you raise the temperature, it impacts the water cycle. And so therefore it's impacting everything that we do and all of the services that we provide. So for our region, most people listening in probably know this, but we are going to see increases in precipitation, increases in sea levels. Extreme storms are going to become more intense. Air temperature is increasing, and drought, the global climate model projections are really not very certain whether we're going to see more or less drought. So we don't really have a lot of confidence in that and which direction it's going to go. But 3 of these big impacts are going to increase our flood risk. So we're not only concerned about the flood risk to our critical facilities and systems that provide these critical services to millions of people, but also to the reduced capacity of our drainage system, and just that can cause infrastructure flooding as well. So those are the impacts, and I've started to touch on this, but coastal, riverine, and infrastructure-based flooding are things that we are vulnerable to and preparing for. This map on the left you can see is showing you 1 through 7 feet of sea level rise. So that's what would happen. This is Southwest Philadelphia, kind of near the airport and showing parts of the Navy Yard. So that's a major concern of ours, is this sort of surface flooding component. We're also concerned about what's happening underground to our infrastructure, like pipes, due to groundwater changes. So kind of flooding at the surface and also below grade is kind of how we think about it. We're also really concerned about water quality impacts. So as we get more intense precipitation, we have runoff issues, turbidity in the water, meaning it gets cloudy and dirty. That makes it harder for us to treat. We have chemistry changes with increases in air temperature and water temperature. That's going to change our treatment processes. We could have more things growing in our source waters, leading to algal blooms. So just the quality of the water itself is also a concern. And then we're also very concerned and paying attention to the salt front. So again, we take our water, drinking water, directly from the Schuylkill and Delaware River, and both of those are tidal. On the Schuylkill, it's tidal up to the Fairmount Dam, and on the Delaware, it's tidal all the way up to Trenton. So we are impacted by sea level rise, and there's this area called the salt front where freshwater and saltwater mix, and that could potentially move farther upstream, and the risk is that it could reach our Baxter drinking water intake. So we have an entire team that works on water quality modeling here at the water department. So our team coordinates with them to study this issue and think of ways to address it. So our team has developed long and short-term strategies to address these risks. We really, we're a team of 4 staff. And so we really, really value developing in-house expertise because we, for our department to actually adapt and prepare for this, we need to empower the entire staff across all units to really think about climate and embed it in the work that they do. So that's really that mainstreaming component. So giving people the information and tools so that they can use it in plans, programs, and policies in all the work that we do. We also conduct specific flood risk assessments. We're starting to do that at all of our treatment plants. And we leverage funds to implement these adaptation projects. So we're looking for ways to partner with groups, to apply for federal funds. And then that last piece is that partnership and coordination between internal and external stakeholders, which I don't have time to go into the specifics, but I think a lot of that will come out today in some of the questions and answers that we give. So these 2 pieces, so developing this in-house expertise and mainstreaming the use of climate information, that's really happening through our climate resilient planning and design guidance, which was recently adopted just last month as policy for the water department. So the tools and information that we're providing is actually now a policy that it's required to be used in all of the planning and design that we do here at the water department. Some examples of the tools within that guidance are, we built a coastal inundation model so we can provide images and risk information to our staff that shows them where things would flood under different future scenarios. We also have updated tools with climate projections. So an IDF curve, I don't really have time to go into detail about how this works. I'm happy to go back to this later. But what this is showing is that for a 100-year event, this is a precipitation event, we would see about 3 inches of rain per hour. That's a 100-year event today. But with climate projections, by the end of the century, if we use a high emission scenario, a 3-inch per hour event would really become a 30-year return period, meaning that it has a much higher % chance of happening in any given year. So these are the tools that we can provide to people that are working on, developing our sewer system or storm flood relief systems so that they're forward looking and preparing for these precipitation increases. And then just really briefly, we have an internal flood risk management coordination team that happens. We meet quarterly, and it has staff from all these different units across the department. And then we also do a lot of coordination across the city, mainly through the Flood Risk Management Task Force, but we also do work with individual agencies and departments on project-based initiatives, and we meet regularly with Saleem in the Office of Sustainability. So we do a lot of coordination as well, because this work can't happen in a vacuum. If we're going to protect a treatment plant, we should also protect the neighborhoods and other critical facilities nearby. So I'll end it there.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you so much, Abby. Clearly the water department is, at the forefront of the, city's efforts to understand the impacts of climate change and provide information to others to make the city more resilient. But even so, flooding events have occurred, do occur, and will still occur, and communities have to deal with them. So one Philadelphia community that has been particularly affected by repeated flooding is the Eastwick neighborhood, which many of us are aware of. So now we're going to hear from Carolyn Mosley, who will speak about the challenges faced by a community vulnerable to flooding. So Carolyn, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. And thanks for inviting the Eastwick community to participate. because it's really important to show some of the impacts, as it impacts human beings. Eastwick is a community we are the lowest lying community in the city of Philadelphia. We're at the bottom of the bowl, which makes us extra vulnerable to catastrophic flooding events. We are a community that, we just experience repetitive catastrophic flooding. Could you advance the slide, please? Next slide. Okay. Okay, you can see from some of the pictures, this community's been flooding since the 1930s. This is nothing new. And this is the earliest that it's been put on record that we know of. And of course, federal government promised a dam. We didn't get it. 65 years later, during Hurricane Floyd, this is what our community looked like. And Tropical Storm Isaias in August of 2020. This is our rec center in the community. Tropical Storm Isaias. And as you see, the pictures, there was nowhere safe to go. People needed to be rescued out of their homes. We did not get a declaration of disaster. We did not get assistance from federal, state, or even local government. And it was during the time of a pandemic. Other communities that experienced catastrophic flooding, aid was given to them, but none for Eastwick. We are still in the process of trying to raise money, raising funds to try to recover. We've been relying upon VOAD groups that aren't even from Philadelphia to help us. And here's a gentleman, this poor gentleman's been flooded about 10 times since he's lived here in this community. So you see, the aftermath or the effects. Okay, we can stop the slideshow there. Thank you. So, and I'll just speak a little bit about the next slide. The Eastwick tends to be a very resilient community. And we have come up with our own proposal or concept that will keep people safe, avoid displacement from our community, as well as make people whole, because this situation is no fault of any of the residents. So, we can talk a little bit about that, a little later on. But the effects of flooding, they're both obviously physical, loss of physical property and life, as well as trauma. It's the trauma that sets in when many of us, we hear the sound of the raindrops, that sort of soothes us, comforts us. But people here in Eastwick, they're walking the floors at night to make sure they're not going to be flooded out. They're keeping that emergency bag by a door, or having their child go to therapy because they're afraid every time they hear the raindrops that the man in the big hat is going to come and take them out in a boat. We had an elderly couple who could not make it up the steps during Tropical Storm Isaias. When rescue got to them, they were sitting on the steps holding hands with water up to their neck, just waiting for the inevitable to happen. And we as a community have come together, created allies, forming allies, and working with city agencies and departments to finally address and hopefully to bring some resolution to our situation. And what we're really hoping for is that, because we realize that we're not the only community in the city of Philadelphia that floods, nor are we the only community in the country that floods. But given the gravity of our flooding issue and other environmental issues, what we're hoping is that we can be used as an example to create a resolution to the problem as whole. Okay, and I'm gonna stop right there to allow time for questions. And I'll give it back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks so much, Carolyn. So we're gonna let each of the speakers present before we go to questions. But again, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So Carolyn, that was, a really insightful look into the, challenges that residents, face in flood-prone areas and the challenges they face in, securing resources to help with recovery. So that, in mind, now I'm going to turn it over to Saleem Chapman, the city's Chief Resilience Officer, who is going to talk about the challenge of coordinating the efforts of city departments to work together to prepare for flooding and to also be able to provide and direct assistance to communities that are most vulnerable. So, Saleem, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Yeah, for me, this is a really, really exciting topic to talk about because it's really personal. So as a native Philadelphian, I've seen firsthand how our flood risk has evolved over time. I started my career many years ago working with Ms. Mosley and in Eastwick and find myself now as the city's first Chief Resilience Officer picking up that mantle and trying to continue that work. And it's really been interesting to have the opportunity over the last year from the perspective of Chief Resilience Officer to really engage in this work. And really my role is really to try to create an enabling environment for sort of advancing resilience. And whether it was sort of intentional or unintentional, I think the order of the speaking order sort of hit it very well, because I think my work really exists at the intersection between equity and historical injustice that communities are experiencing, and really thinking about how we take our technical expertise and technical tools to sort of try to solve those problems. And at this moment, when we've received sort of stark evidence of the increased risks that Philadelphia is facing, both in the form of Tropical Storm Isaias and Ida, I think I've seen how we relate to this issue has sort of evolved in a series of ways, right? So I think narrative building, certainly we need to sort of integrate the dialogue between equity and resilience. So, a lot of the dialogue has been around Ida, for rightfully so. It impacted a large section of the region, but as Ms. Carolyn talked about, Isaias devastated the community of Eastwick as well, and that hasn't necessarily gotten the same level of press as we, would have liked it to get. And so I think what we have to really understand is that what are sort of the structural dynamics that sort of make those conditions possible? What are the power dynamics that make those conditions possible? What are sort of the social capital inequities that make those things possible? And how do we work with communities to sort of try to resolve those things in a way that builds trust, but ultimately sort of follows their leadership? And so that's, to me, a key part of the work that we're trying to do, but also some of the challenges that we're continuing to see, because the pace of climate change is certainly moving faster than our abilities to sort of resolve some of these historical dynamics. The next piece I've seen a lot of changes around demonstrated practice. So, much of this work requires a sort of transformative shift in how systems operate, and navigating, this uncertainty can be incredibly difficult. And so it's not surprising that we sometimes find ourselves really overwhelmed by sort of the effort that it takes to sort of initiate and change, particularly when you're talking about an institutional setting like government. And so much of the foundational work that we've tried to do in the last year has really revolved around sort of showcasing feasible pathways to resilience outcomes. And, we've worked with the Resilience Cabinet. So when the mayor established my position in the fall of last year, he also convened a Resilience Cabinet. And this group has really taken a comprehensive look at how municipal service delivery and operations are taking place and what needs to happen in order to meet the challenges of our changing climate. And I think you've seen sort of the success of that work even prior to the Community and Resilience Cabinet, with a lot of things that Abby talked about and the leadership that the Philadelphia Water Department has done, and sort of looking at their facilities and the rest that our water systems can have in the future. But we've also made significant progress through other interagencies bodies, such as the city's flood risk management task force, which has really provided the forum for us to coordinate and deliver a whole of government response to communities like Eastwick. So just last week, we had a pretty robust community meeting at Eastwick to sort of try to start a new chapter that really reflects the urgency of the moment and really understands that this is going to have to draw upon all the facets of government in order to meet a challenge of this scale. Outside of government, much of this work has really been about looking at sort of the accelerating pace of major development in the city, particularly along our waterfront areas, and in other areas that's projected to be highly impacted by sea level rise. And so, the question in this context really becomes, what mechanisms are at our disposal for ensuring climate conscious development? And we have to think about that in the context of our political systems, right? So in Philadelphia, there's a lot of different key stakeholders that are part of the development process, and each sort of have different levels of influence in that process, which doesn't necessarily allow for sort of a unilateral top-down approach for one city agency to just be able to establish regulations that will sort of eliminate our flood risk. And so what we've had to do instead is really focus on collaboration and partnership. We've really started to work with some of the major landholders and developers in the lower Schuylkill area, which is facing a lot of the risks that Abby sort of so eloquently discussed, and really try to advance a collective vision for resilience in that area. And so, the value that we see here is not only the ability to sort of work across sectors, but really to also be able to tap into a broad array of funding sources, which is really going to be important for bringing resilience to scale, which we all know can really be difficult. So I'll stop there, just in the context of time, but looking forward to the conversation a little later on.
Thanks, Saleem. That was a really nice overview, focusing on the messages of the challenge of mobilizing government agencies to, or entities or departments to address the twin challenges of equity and resilience. I think, and also balancing the risks of flooding with, the many benefits of new development. So to sort of step back and provide a even slightly broader context, next we're going to be about the intersection of planning and flooding. We're going to be hearing from Clint Andrews, who is working at that intersection and who researches some of the fiscal aspects of the impacts of flooding on city budgets and real estate. So Clint, with that, I think you have a few slides, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and it's good to see everyone this morning. The university has a particular role in society. We try to do research that's useful to the rest of the world, and we also educate people. And in both of those guises, we're trying to put together resources that might be useful here. And a little bit of context, I co-direct a Center for Urban Policy Research, which is coming up on its 50th anniversary next year. And in recent years, we've been very focused on climate adaptation, as well as the sort of the sustainable energy transition, those two themes. And in terms of the research, one of the new things that's come along just this last year is some 5 years of funding that is allowing a multi-university consortium to focus on coastal transformation in this region. And the Wharton Risk Center is a partner, as well as Penn State, as well as Drexel, and a number of other universities spanning the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York area. And so over the next few years, we will be doing a lot of work in communities, we hope, with communities, trying to understand what you need. There's also the teaching dimension, the education dimension. And over the past 5 years, we've developed a program that explicitly tries to cross-train urban planners and climate scientists and engineers so that they can speak one another's languages and get outside of the disciplinary silos that have prevented creative thinking about the risks that need to be managed on our coasts. What I'd like to do now is just spend a minute thinking about I'll call it the broad economics of coastal risk and the challenges. And to motivate this, I'm showing a picture of a house not too far from where I live that was devastated a decade ago by Hurricane Sandy. And in the intervening years, it sat there for a while, but eventually the house was knocked down, and that is now a park. So that this is a neighborhood that underwent a transformation, but sort of a spotty transformation. And that raises an issue, which is that adapting to climate change, to flood risks, isn't only the responsibility of the federal government or the state government or the city government. It's also an area where individual homeowners have some ability to act. And so one way to understand how people can act is to see, well, what's going on with real estate markets, and is the buying and selling of properties affected by issues like flood risk? And one of the things that we see when we look carefully at real estate markets in the coastal zone is first that there are different outcomes in different places. Places that were on the way up continue on their way up. Places that were on the way down get battered worse. The second thing that we see, which is very distressing for many of us, is that the market forgets about risk. And within 3 years after Hurricane Sandy's devastation, we saw that prices were back where they were beforehand. New people come in, they're not aware of the risk, or a different type of buyer starts to get interested in the properties. And pretty soon you have a range of things that might include gentrification of the shore, or people who don't know what they're getting into something problematic. And a final thing that we see there is what I'll call distinct submarkets. So there are investors who come in who really understand flooding risk quite well and price it into their bids. We also see some knowledgeable owner-occupiers who do their homework beforehand. But finally, we see a fair number of what I'll call naive home buyers who don't know to ask about flood risk and get surprised when things happen. And that leads us, and this might be more for tomorrow, but to say that there's a role for public policy, after all, in trying to manage a marketplace that doesn't work very well. And one of the things that we'll be considering, and that hopefully tomorrow you'll start to address, is the fact that there are policy trade-offs. When you try to design policies, you might think you're achieving something, but you might end up not achieving that. And here, based on some of our research, we've seen, first of all, that it is hard to get both fairness, equity, and efficiency out of public policies. There's often a trade-off. What we can do, if we're careful, is try to avoid both inequitable and inefficient solutions, such as, ironically, the requiring of flood insurance. And then we might have to choose between the more equitable solution, which might eliminate disclosure requirements, or the more efficient solution, which might require everyone to elevate their house, whether they can afford it or not. And the implication here is that we need to make sure that we're arguing over the more equitable and more efficient policy ideas. And finally, I want to wrap up by saying that flood risk and the damage from storms affects not just individual property owners who need to be protected from a market that works imperfectly, but it also affects the viability of the jurisdiction where the house is. And so there are fiscal impacts that affect both the revenues. You can't collect property taxes for very long on properties that people can no longer live in. There are also costs or expenditures that municipalities face that get into the day-to-day lives of making sure that we have adequate schools and public safety, but also the specific costs that are imposed by storm events like debris cleanup. And there are a number of things that we see as general problems in the fiscal space. And one is that some types of revenues and expenditures are sticky. If you start to lose population from your jurisdiction, certain costs are not going to go down. They're going to be sticky. The other thing that we're seeing is that some of these costs are what you might call lumpy. In other words, they don't scale up or down nicely if one person leaves town or if two people leave town, but there's suddenly changes quite dramatically when suddenly you have to close down a whole elementary school because there aren't enough kids in it anymore, to pick one example. And so I'll stop there, just closing out with this idea that there are impacts of flood events that appear in the economy, both private and public, and that they are an important part of the story that we have and what we have to deal with, I think, if we're truly going to achieve a resilient outcome.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Clint. You know, I think clearly your comments underscore that there are both, you know, complex and far-reaching fiscal impacts from flooding events that are, you know, are difficult, hard to parse out and understand, and, you know, assign equitably through society. But thankfully, people like you are doing the work you're doing to help advance that cause. So with that, you know, I wanted to maybe pose a few questions to the panelists to allow them to expand on some of these themes. And, you know, while I'm doing that and the panelists are answering some questions, I want to remind you all to put, you know, place your questions in the Q&A, whatever they may be. So I think my first question, I'm gonna target maybe first to Saleem. You know, you certainly mentioned Ida and how Ida was a big deal, and rightfully so. But also a challenge because it maybe turned the city's attention away from dealing with some other issues. But I guess my question is, you know, did Ida impact the priorities and goals of like the city's flood risk management task force? You know, how has that changed the conversation in the city?
Yeah, well, I think the key ways in which it has changed our conversation is to understand how two different outcomes happen, right? So how do we have a situation that happens in Eastwick, which, you know, that was resulting from a totally different type of flooding that was caused by a totally different type of weathering pattern, comparative to the type of flooding that we saw from Ida, which was a totally different type of flooding by a totally different type of weather pattern. So I think it's really helping us understand that, you know, there is not sort of a singular solution for some of these issues. And what's really important for us is to create sort of a menu of options, creating that toolbox that we can use, that we can apply to different parts of the city, depending on what their unique circumstances are. And so one of the things that we focus a lot on within the task force is really thinking through place-based strategies, which really take into account some of the unique factors that each community face and how we're best able to respond to it. And also within the context of place-based strategies, you have to take into account other issues outside of just sort of the ecological aspects, right? So what were some of the factors that contributed to, you know, a disaster declaration not necessarily being received by Eastwick, and what were sort of the financial supports or safety net supports that was needed to make that community recover in comparison to other neighborhoods in Ida who might have a stronger safety net or ability to recover faster. So, you know, we have to sort of look at these things in a more comprehensive way and understand that the complexity of the challenge is really going to require us to sort of think bigger and broader than probably we would have expected, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Right. And sort of a follow-up question, you and Carolyn mentioned that there was no disaster declaration for Isaias, even though specifically in Eastwick, it was a pretty impactful event. Maybe this is just a more specific piece of what you're already saying, but without that disaster declaration, a big piece of financial support for recovery is removed. I mean, has the city thought about what do you do in a situation like that? How do you provide resources to a community that's affected, but you don't have that federal funding support in that situation?
Well, I certainly think, as Carolyn would say, we probably haven't done that very well, and that's probably true. I think that's complete. To be honest, I mean, I think Philadelphia is a resource-constrained city. We have a lot of crises, and certainly aren't necessarily set up to be respond to all of them with the type of capacity that are probably needed. And so what I can say is that experience has forced us to think about what are the things we need to put in place so that if we don't get financial support from the federal government, how are we able to support residents in that process? And some of that is pre-event issues such as, or responses such as sort of increasing participation in the National Flood Insurance Program and making sure that that's financially accessible for residents who may not be able to afford that otherwise, and what sort of interventions might be needed to make that possible. Making sure that we are providing better response systems so that residents sort of can do their best to mitigate some of the conditions to their property, but also making sure that we're making the recovery process easier on the back end and making sure that we're reducing the bureaucratic hurdles that might often, get in the way of sort of an efficient response with the things that the city is already in a position to do. So by no means have we perfected that process, but I will certainly say, the experience from SIAS certainly gave us a lot to think about, and we're certainly trying to work through those things.
Yeah, no, that's a great response, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of challenges that you honestly reflected on there. So thanks, Saleem. So my next question, maybe this one is for Abby. You talked about the climate resilience guidelines. Excited to hear that those have recently been released. Are those guidelines completely? Who are they intended for? Are they totally voluntary? What's in there? Is that a way to communicate some of the climate information like you were talking about with the precipitation curves? And if not, how do you get that information out to partners, or is that through the climate through the guidelines? How is that document supposed to work in the coming years?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I think there's a really important point I'd like to make related to that, and that is that this guidance was made specifically for the water department. And anybody that works with climate projections will know that there's an inherent amount of uncertainty in these projections, right? There's uncertainty in like how many carbon emissions the world is going to put off in the next 100 years. There's uncertainty in how the earth is going to respond to those, that increasing blanket of greenhouse gases around the earth. There's uncertainty in things outside of climate, like population growth and all these things. And so when you come up with guidance, you often have to think about several things when you're coming up with guidance, and it really depends on the application. And so for the water department, we provide drinking water to millions of people. And so we consider ourselves as having a very low risk tolerance, right? So one of the things you would think about is the risk tolerance that you have. Another thing you might think about is how long the asset is going to be in the ground, or how long the service is going to be provided. Another thing you might think about is adaptive capacity. So how easily could your system be adapted? And we have this huge system underground that is really challenging and expensive to dig up and make changes to. And so we don't have a high adaptive capacity. We have a really low risk tolerance because we provide these critical services. We have long useful lifespans. When we build an asset or put a treatment plan in, it's going to be there for the next 100 years. So for all of these reasons, our guidance is very in the engineering world, we call it conservative, meaning we're using really high emission scenarios. We're going to plan for the worst and hope for the best. But we want to make sure that the water department is sort of prepared for, the worst that might happen over the next 100 years. And so this guidance is really specific to water and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. And it's probably not appropriate to apply it citywide. Although I do think the information, we do share information, we share assessment results, we coordinate with other departments. I've worked personally on planning commission projects, with guidance on sea level rise issues. So I think, that's a really important point, that this document is really intended for internal use at the water department. And we are, working on developing an externally facing document that would share this information in a way that I think is appropriate with some of the caveats of what I just expressed.
That's a great point, Abby, that I wasn't even really thinking about when I necessarily asked the question. But yeah, that risk tolerance is really, unique to your department and the assets you manage, and the goals and the fundamental importance of providing water to the city's population. But that risk tolerance may be different for different assets, different groups, different people, different communities, different situations. I think the next question is perhaps directed for you, Carolyn. You certainly talked about, made it clear that Eastwick is one of the more vulnerable neighborhoods to flooding in the city. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the experience of residents in storms like Isaias. I'm not sure if I'm ever saying that right. And maybe some more specifics. You guys about what portion of the neighborhood is affected, how many residents were affected, how many people have flood insurance to help out, how many people don't, of course, there was no disaster declaration. I don't know if you get into reasons why that was, but given that, what services has the city been able to provide, given that they are resource constrained, or what other partners have been, helping and partnering with Eastwick to help address, these concerns and help residents and empower them to at least face the challenges of flooding, among other things.
Right, sure, certainly. There is a section of this community, we call them the planet streets: Saturn, Venus, Mercury. The name of the other street escapes me right now, but we refer to them as planet streets. And that was a portion of this community that was built along the creek, along Cobbs and Darby Creek, which is a waterway that runs through the community. And in as much as, it's a beautiful sight to see when you look out of your window, it's nice little babbling creek that runs, maybe 40, 50 feet outside of your home. It's also a source of misery when that creek overflows and ends up into your home. There are about 300 homes, a little better than 300 homes that were built in that area. And again, this community's been flooding since the 30s. You're talking about structures that were built in the 70s, early 70s. So we ask ourselves, how did that happen? So I want to step back and just give you briefly a historic overview of this community. The Eastwick community is a product of a failed implementation of one of the largest urban renewal plans in the history of this nation. 10,000 people, this was back in the 50s, 10,000 residents, businesses, and religious institutions were displaced from this community to make way for a city within a city. That's when the urban renewal plan was urban renewal program was raising. HUD made all this money available. And here you had this community very well integrated. intact, very resilient, self-sustaining community, and where residents were just coexisting harmoniously. Residents of all races, religions, creeds, colors, you name it, and at a time in our history where racial strife was raging throughout the country. Wasn't here in Eastwick. Urban renewal came along to make way for this new community, an urban development with a suburban feel. That was the goal. And as these people were being displaced from this community with a promise that they could come back, promise never fulfilled, these homes were constructed along the creek. And there's other sections that have other sections in the community that has their own issues, but let's just focus on the homes that were constructed along the creek. As people began to experience flooding, and even back in the 30s, even before the new development was built, as you saw from the slide, back in the 30s, people were being rescued. So it was a known fact that this area flooded. It was a known fact that we are the lowest lying community in the city of Philadelphia and very vulnerable. Sea level rise, climate change now exacerbates these conditions. The community's cry for help has not been addressed, or the flooding issue has not been resolved. And the community has truly taken a position that enough is enough. How does it impact? In my opening statement, trauma, physical damage, not only to your personal property, but to your physical being. There was one flood, we call them survivors, we don't call them victims. One survivor said it's like somebody just snatches your soul right out of your body. Your memories are just on the street waiting for the trash to come pick them up. That's the impact. So that 300 or so or plus residents, many of whom have experienced flooding multiple times, have had to rebuild their lives over and over and over and over again. So let's talk about flood insurance. Some people don't have flood insurance because they were not required to have flood insurance. Either they were coming into the neighborhood, moved into the neighborhood, perhaps didn't require a mortgage, or maybe inherited a property from a relative, had no clue that they were in a flood zone. The mortgage company was not involved and said, oh, you must carry flood insurance. Or their home is paid for. They've been a resident for over 30 years. No need to carry flood insurance. And flood insurance premiums are going upwards of $10,000 a year for residents. It is cost prohibitive. Some people just can't afford to do that. And then they think in their minds, and I think we all do math calculations in our mind, should I, shouldn't I? Well, if this is only going to happen every 100 years, what's the likelihood? So not realizing and understanding what the impacts of climate change, that 100 years could turn into 20 years, 10 years, 2 months, we don't know, because that's an unknown. So in the end, there are some folks who do rent homes. So, and there's no requirement for a landlord to tell their renter that they're in a flood zone. We have people who are homeless today because they were renting a property. The landlord didn't tell them, but yet the landlord had the insurance and he's fixed up these properties that he was renting and has now rented them out to someone else, some other unsuspecting person. After Tropical Storm Isaias, those who did make repairs or have had repairs made to their home, sale signs went up like nobody's business. I had people knocking on my door on a Sunday night asking me to retract a statement that I made to the press stating that this area floods. I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. It's too much documentation showing that this area floods. And I understand that they want to get out, but at what risk? I'm not going to, be deceptive in any way. So those are, many of the challenges that we as a community must face. And as I stated earlier, we have had to come up with our own recommendation for a solution and put it on the table, because there's large tracts of vacant land back here in this community that it's in a 500-year floodplain, city-owned land. Hey, look, let's get these folks out of harm's way. Loss of life is not an option for us. And if we could do some sort of a land swap with the city, that would, number one, ensure the safety of the individuals by getting them to higher ground. Number two, to avoid displacement of residents, because we don't want to repeat what happened 50, 60 years ago, where people were displaced from the community. And number three, to make them whole. Because we're where we are because of bad decisions that were made decades ago by the city officials who were in power at that time. And unfortunately, the folks that you see here on this call from the city, as well as the residents that live in this community, we're left to clean up their mess, from those bad decisions. But now that we know better, we can do better. We're in the 21st century. Technology has changed. It has advanced. We're more aware of the problem of the climate change. And the city is now taking proactive steps to redefine itself to address these issues.
Carolyn, thank you so much. That was such a great overview of, I don't know, the tangled web of problems that we weave. Great overview history of the community and how these problems kind of evolved and came to be, and how the residents that live there now are sort of stuck with them, and they're kind of intractable. And the dynamics of flood insurance. It's a great tool, but some how things fall through the cracks and how it doesn't work for everybody in every situation. My follow-up question was going to be solutions. You mentioned some kind of big picture solutions there, which is really important. I guess kind of a question to maybe all the panelists, but the city panelists. What is the current thinking regarding solutions to problems in a neighborhood like Eastwick, and in light of the long history that Carolyn just underlined, and then also I assume the answer is yes, but I guess are there lessons to be learned by this process that can be applied to future development projects and proposals? And anyone can take that question.
I'll jump in with one comment, which is a lot of what we have been hearing about is government providing information to people and using it for creating better infrastructure decisions, which is absolutely right and important. But we have also been hearing about people who found themselves in a floodplain, owning or renting a property, and being surprised by when a disaster strikes. And to me, that says we need to look at the real estate professionals and ask, well, what are you doing? You are the crucial actors here. And just one example, most of us know what the multiple listing service is. That's where you go and see that a house is for sale, and you can learn how many bedrooms it has, and whether it has granite countertops and all those kinds of things. And there is a space in that database to say whether it's in the floodplain or not. But I know we went and actually looked in that database for several different parts of the country and found out that somehow they just never quite got around to filling in that part of the database. It's just blank. And that's something where I think we could use a little bit of regulatory kick-ass to improve things.
That's a good point. Thank you, Clint. You know, the real estate profession has a big role to play here, as it was, you know, partly involved in the original creation of problems in Eastwick. Are there any other thoughts on you know, solutions to the Eastwick problem, or steps in that direction?
I'm happy to start off, and then Saleem can chime in if he has more to add. I mean, I think it's a really, obviously it's a complicated, really tragic situation. One thing I'd like to two things I'd quickly like to point out are, one, you know, when Eastwick was established and redeveloped, these communities were built before the floodplains were mapped by FEMA and before there was a national flood insurance program. And so that risk information really may not have been known at the time. That's not giving, you know, the government at the time a pass at all, but just saying that I think our understanding of the risk has really increased over time. And another thing that makes flood risk so great in Philadelphia is land use change, right? And so you alluded to that you're in this low-lying area that was once a wetland, right? And so fill was brought in, and these areas want to go back to, you know, being wet. And so land use change also increases that flood risk over time, because there's also, you know, I mentioned the wetlands, but there's also impervious cover. So as the communities around Philadelphia and as Philadelphia became more urbanized, we paved over these areas that could absorb water. And so all of that water is going into the watershed and increasing that flood risk over time as we grow and develop. So I think it's really tricky in the first place, like where, you know, understanding that flood risk and how it's increased over time. And then as far as responding, I mean, I don't think Saleem would disagree that we have not done a great job of responding, and we need to do better. And there have been efforts to understand the issue and look at solutions. You know, the water departments worked very closely with the Army Corps, but that's been years and years, and there's no solution yet. And so I live in West Philly. I understand from like a human emotional perspective that that's not acceptable. I will say that we are continuing to work with them. They are one of the very few sources of funding for developing a large mitigation, you know, flood mitigation projects. So we will continue with that partnership. But we are also, so our team is working with researchers from Drexel and Phillips Institute on looking at compound flood modeling in Eastwick, because it's really a complex issue. You have the tidal piece, you have, you know, this convergence of the Darby and Cobbs Creek. And so really trying to understand more about what's causing the flooding and how it will change with climate change. And I think that, you know, we're working, I think Franco Montalto at Drexel has been working very closely with the community to try to understand if the solutions that Eastwick Unite is interested in, you know, what does that look like with our mapping? So I think it's not a good enough answer for the people that are living through these experiences and this trauma, but there are people that care deeply about this issue in city government that are trying to make progress on the issue. So that's the best I can say.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. So I think it's two things. One, I think let's address these issues intersectionally, right? So like Eastwick doesn't just have flooding issues. And I know Miss Carolyn didn't get into it, but it has sinking homes. It's near Superfund sites. It has other sort of environmental harms near it. So it's making sure any solutions we do take into account all those different things. And then the second piece is make sure they're not disempowering, right? So I don't think the solution is to look to government to figure it out. I think it's how government is creating a space and bringing the right folks together to solve the problem. That's where I think we start.
And if I might just jump in, the community is very much in support. For the first time in years, we finally feel that our voices have been heard. You know, and we just started pulling out all the stops to make sure that our voices are heard and to tell our story. A number of documentaries are being worked on to tell the Eastwick story from how we got here, where we are now, and where do we see ourselves going. And one important thing I think to remember is that, because we've heard rumblings and suggestions, I'll put it like that, suggestions of possible solutions, and which would include buyouts. What does a buyout look like? How does a buyout make it whole? But the important thing you have to keep in mind is that for all of us, for wherever we live, it's home. It's home. It's what we identify with. It's where we have chosen to be for whatever those reasons might be. And giving up a home and going elsewhere, what does that look like? What types of traumas and consideration should be made? How do you help people stay on their feet? Because we all know that relocation doesn't really make you whole. Because by the time you deduct the mortgage from the current market value, you're starting all over again. And if some of us who are over 50, who wants to start over with a whole mortgage process again? I'm finished paying for my home. I don't do that anymore. And just trying to adapt to a new environment and that kind of thing. So, there's the human factor that weighs very heavily on these decisions. Other countries have come up with solutions. And like someone always says, well, if they can build the Panama Canal and the Hoover Dam, why can't the flooding be stopped in Eastwick?
Thanks, thanks, Carolyn. That was a nice closing statement. It's clearly a problem that certainly, given all what we heard, is certainly worthy of a documentary. But it's also something that's thankfully getting a lot of attention. And a lot of folks are seriously trying to consider how we can figure this thing out and make it work in the best possible way for the folks who live in the community. We could continue to go on that, but we have had some questions entered from audience members, and I just want to give some time for them. I have them up on my screen, and I think I'll relay one now as the first one that came up. It was from Kermit. I'm not seeing the last name, Kermit. I forget your last name. I'm sorry. But it's the question is, water main breaks are common in Philadelphia. Oh, it's just Kermit. Okay, are quite common in Philadelphia, and yes, they are. We had one in our neighborhood just a couple weeks ago up here in the Northwest. But it's another kind of flooding issue, and the question is, I'm wondering how climate change will increase the strain on aging infrastructure, and if the water department plans to address this problem. So I guess Abby, you would probably be the likely person to take it first.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. That's a really, really good question. I think we talked about riverine flooding, coastal flooding. This is this third piece, right? Infrastructure flooding. And usually we think of infrastructure flooding related to our stormwater system. So if that storm comes through and we can't drain it fast enough, certain neighborhoods might flood. But this is a totally different type of infrastructure flooding, right? So it's that flooding that occurs if a water main breaks. This is not my area of expertise, but I do know that we have an entire program that looks at replacing water mains. And so there's like a scoring criteria to identify, which areas are the oldest. We have leak detection programs that use acoustics to try to find out where those leaks are, which are often where these big breaks happen. I think we replace around 19 miles of water mains a year, which is actually a really big deal when you think about digging up an entire, 19 miles of the city to replace these. So we're trying to address the issue. With that said, you can never, ever predict where it's going to happen. And it can be devastating. And so I'd say what we try to do is respond as quickly as we can and get people back to having, the water service in their homes. Oftentimes you have that pressure loss. Really interesting question about the climate though. I do think that there's a potential for climate change to exacerbate this issue because oftentimes we see these breaks in the months where the ground is thawing and freezing and thawing and freezing. And so with climate change, you can have what we call climate whiplash, where you go from like extreme temperatures, high temperatures down to freezing and then back up. And so it's really that, that temperature change that can cause these breaks in the first place. And so I do think there's a possibility for climate change to make this issue more challenging in the future. We have not, I'm admitting, we have not done any big studies to assess that or try to quantify like how it might increase the amount of breaks that we see. But it is something that we're aware of, and it was identified through a survey of what our vulnerabilities are. And so, it's on our radar. We just haven't really done, deep assessments yet to figure that out.
Thanks, Abby. So the next question I have is from Michelle Niedermeyer, and she asks, how are the various agencies balancing development and the tax base, benefits of development with known risks to human and environmental health now and in the future, especially with respect to environmental and social justice? And I would also add, how is that work? And maybe, Saleem, you could reflect on this. How difficult or what has the process been in getting city agencies to cooperate and coordinate with regard to, evaluating development proposals vis-a-vis flooding, to, at a worst case scenario, prevent, little mini Eastwicks from popping up in the future?
Well, I alluded to this earlier in my remarks. Philadelphia's political culture is that our district council members have a lot of influence and direction and sort of development in the city. And so I think that that's an important component that shouldn't get lost in this, is that it has to sort of work collaboratively. It needs to be sort of a collective approach, both with city agencies and administration as a whole, as well as our legislative branch, as well as the private sector. And so to that point, there isn't necessarily one thing that one agency can do. And I know there's some of our colleagues from the Philadelphia Planning Commission on the call, and I'm sure they would probably add some insights to this via the chat. But yeah, there isn't necessarily one thing that one city agency could do to sort of respond to this. So I think our best option, which again, I alluded to my earlier remarks, is collaboration. Let's work with folks. Let's make sure that they have the information that they need to accurately understand their risk. Luckily, that's not necessarily something that the city has to do unilaterally. We know that both financial sectors and real estate sectors are taking this more into account. Mortgage underwriters are looking at climate risk as a part of their processes for funding a mortgage. And so to that extent, the private sector is in some ways a little bit ahead of us in understanding the needs to sort of take these approaches. I think where the city comes into play is to make sure that those things work complementary, right? So that anything that any one individual is doing to protect their site doesn't have a negative impact on surrounding areas. And really making sure that we're reducing, the residual risk in the public right of way, because even if, you have somebody who's elevating their building structure, which we saw during Ida, right? Like there were a lot of sort of development along the Schuylkill that was elevated, where sort of no one was adversely impacted from the flood risk, but that they still had to be evacuated from their homes because the surrounding public right of way was completely flooded. So we need to make sure that those things are addressed as well. So the simple answer to that question is that there isn't an easy multi-step process for us to do, but I think we're sort of trying to work with our public sector and our developers to try to come up with an approach that works for everyone and make sure that all of our key stakeholders in government have say in that process as well.
And if I might just add to that, with the last 4 or 5 years, a Lower Eastwick public land strategy was developed with the input of the community. It was a community-based approach to help to identify and determine highest and best use to vacant land in our area. And a steering committee was formed, which residents also participated in, to sort of help guide and have input, sitting right there at the table on the process of developer selection, or the development of the request for proposals and development selection. And of course, during the initial, I would say, implementation or the selection process of developers for 2 or 3 parcels back here in Eastwick, that's when tragedy struck again, with flooding. and the community residents, and I served on that steering committee. We approached our councilperson, Councilman Kenyatta Johnson, to put a moratorium on all development until we could get our arms around the issues of flooding, which he did. So, that was yet another example of a bottom-up approach, an example of resiliency and the input and the power of the community to sort of help to bring solutions to our community in response to the flooding issue.
Thanks, Carolyn. And also a good example of taking a step back and thinking about decisions holistically. And thanks as well, Saleem, for your response. So the next question comes from John Hawk. This is directed towards Professor Andrews. How can private investors, owners, and developers share fiscal risks to public services and infrastructure that their locational decisions either create or increase?
That's an interesting question. If I were looking for a place to live and I didn't want to risk whatever nest egg I had, I might rent instead of buy a house or an apartment. And that is one of the ways to share the risk. And there's a lot of hedge fund managers buying up real estate, residential real estate happening these days, which is helpful in that regard, although it's also awful in another regard, because it makes it harder for you to build financial equity in a home if you're renting. And so I think there is a role here for taking the self-interested financial folks, capital, and marrying it to a need of society, which is to provide housing for people. But it's going to have some side effects, such as limiting your ability to build wealth among people who don't have it. Is that a good trade-off? That's what I was getting at earlier. It's a solution, but there's a trade-off associated with it. I think it's unreasonable to expect money to flow in directions that where it won't earn a return. That's just being naive about the way the world works. So maybe that's the sort of trade-off we're willing to tolerate for certain people at certain stages of their life. If you're not in your the years when you're trying to build that nest egg, maybe it makes sense.
Thank you, Clint. The next question is from Zach, and Zach says that they saw that PWD has an online survey called Philadelphia Flooding Survey, where individuals can report flooding, and those responses are used for flood analysis. I was wondering when the survey launched and what have been the outcomes of it, number of data points, and has that data helped to inform or refine flood models? Is that something you're familiar with, Abby, the Philadelphia Flooding Survey?
I mean, I'm familiar with it in that I know it exists, but we have an entire group that works on storm flood relief that is more about updating and creating projects for our drainage system. And so they're the ones that kind of hold that information. I know we have a significant amount of data points, and it recently was changed so that we can do a better job with sort of geolocating where those responses are coming in. But unfortunately, I can try to get more information for Zach, but I don't have any specifics. I mean, I know we use the information in our flood risk management task force meetings. We talk about, what people have responded to recently with different events that come in. But if you want us like specifics of how it's used, I know we've done some geospatial analysis, but I don't know like results or how it's been used in the exact projects or plans.
Thanks, Abby.
Yeah.
I have a next question from Troy Ludlow. He asks, are the flooding problems in Eastwick indicative of what may happen to other parts of the city? But I think the meat of the question is, are there other low-lying areas that may be impacted in a similar way in the future as a result of climate change? Or, what other areas is the city looking at that are particularly vulnerable?
Well, I think that we saw, in recent flood events, Delaware Avenue went underwater. And I believe it was Ida, or maybe there was another strong storm. We saw the part of the Vine Street Expressway go underwater. While they may not be the lowest lying areas, they were low enough to be submerged underwater. So, to answer, and Manayunk, poor Manayunk, and that, they have a body of water there, and it just, poor Main Street just gets hit. But just speaking in terms of elevation, Eastwick is at the bottom of the bowl. It doesn't mean that there aren't other communities that are not vulnerable to flooding, depending how the storms occur, and just a different type of flooding events, because different flooding events and the direction the storm comes in, they're all factors. Because we were pleasantly shocked, but sad for the others. Eastwick, we missed Ida. We dodged that bullet. We did not know how. I think everybody, when we hear it's going to rain, we all get out in front of our homes and do a anti-rain dance, to keep the flood waters out, because we've experienced it so much. But other areas of the city and north of us did, they were devastated. So there's really not one area over the other or more than the other. I think that all of these areas are important to us. The airport, we've seen modeling, that projected modeling that shows if we don't do anything to address this climate change, in 30, 40, 50 years, that airport will be underwater, just because it's its location to the river and other factors and tributaries, going over into the Delaware River. So, it's almost like a coin toss. It's Mother Nature, and she is so unpredictable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that harkens back to something Saleem said, that there's different types of flooding and different types of events that affect different communities in different ways. And, we all have to respond and think about all of them, which just, heightens the challenge and how to equitably meet all those needs. And Carolyn, it's a good segue into another question we have from Kermit, a second question from Kermit O. He mentions that the Philadelphia airport has received $30 billion from the Federal Aviation Administration. We're all kind of all familiar with the airport's plans to expand. And he says, given that airport is already on a floodplain, and a new runway presumably would only expand that, what accountability measures are in place or could be in place to mitigate the increased flooding risk to climate change, and also perhaps increased risk to Eastwick from the airport? I'm not familiar if that's physically an issue, that the airport could expand flooding risks elsewhere. But the airport's a big question, but I'm just sort of repeating what Kermit asks here. So does anyone want to take that?
I can certainly shed some light, because the airport is one of the stakeholders in our community. If I leave my house at 5 minutes after to get to the airport, I get there at 5 minutes after. So we're in very close proximity, and the airport has been a very involved and very supportive partner with the Eastwick community. And before the pandemic, BC, I call that before COVID, took place, the airport was embarking on an expansion through the capacity enhancement program. They needed to add runways so that they could accommodate what would be anticipated to be increased air travel. And during the pandemic, of course, much of that was sort of put on hold, because who knew what was going to happen. So recently, I'm going to say within the past 6-7 months, the airport held a community meeting, or a meeting for the residents of Eastwick to talk about what their current focus is right now. And what they found, and of course, just like everybody else, any other industry, the airport lost a lot of revenue during the pandemic. So they had to redirect their focus. And one thing that they realized was that, there's money to be made in the cargo industry. We are carriers. So rather than laying more runways to accommodate and bring more passengers in and out of Philadelphia, we need to look at expanding our cargo business or creating it. They already had a cargo business, but expanding the cargo business. Airlines are now making flight planes larger so that they carry more people. And based on our meeting and our discussions is that the capacity enhancement program has really redirected itself and is now focusing more on the cargo aspect. And because of the building of the larger planes, they no longer need to expand the runways. That was the proposed, through the original capacity enhancement program. So I believe that the utilization of the funds, the $30 million that, I'm really not, sure about that, or I don't know about that. It might be redirected now into the cargo aspect of it. And yes, they are very worried about this community in terms of flooding and flood mitigations. They realize that, their infrastructure will be impacted as well. And so we are working together through the city's Office of Resilience to arrive at some mutually beneficial strategy to address the flooding problem.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I do know that, certainly this airport and everyone involved in it is very aware that, the airport's in a vulnerable location and is vulnerable to several types of flooding. And it's also great to hear from you that the airport is aware of and concerned about their impacts on their neighbors and, working collaboratively with the communities that they share. So I'm very glad to hear that. So, we're running out of time. This schedule was the session was scheduled to run to 12:30, and it was just about 12:30. So I'd like to wrap things up first by again thanking Zoe and also especially thanking all of our panelists for joining us today. You all did an excellent job talking about the many complicated and interrelated challenges of dealing with flooding, and certainly when these problems are in place, there's a lot of issues and they're hard to solve, but it's good to see, and they're very personally impactful to those who experience them on the ground. But I think there's a growing awareness about that, and there's a lot of efforts and consciousness in the city about tackling these challenges.